Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Tim Bewes. I teach in the English department here at Brown, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the first ever political concepts debate on the topic, is the present historical moment unprecedented? So we're especially delighted to welcome our two distinguished speakers, whom I'll introduce in a moment. But let me first say a few words about how we got here. We meaning not the world, but the Political Concepts Committee, organising committee. Political Concepts at Brown is an initiative housed here at the Kogut Institute for the Humanities and directed by Adi Ophir, visiting professor of humanities and Middle East studies. Its organising committee comprises 5 members besides Adi and myself. They are Ainsley Lesueur from political science, Brian Meeks from Africana Studies, and Vazira Zaminda from history. As most people here know, I think, our main activity is an annual conference lasting 2 days and comprising 30-minute talks on concepts that our speakers are encouraged to develop or reinvent for specific political purposes, which they explain in the course of their talks. This year we have changed format, partly as a response to the gravity of our historical moment, a gravity materialized by the global rise of authoritarianism, by 2 years of genocidal actions in Gaza, and by the war in Ukraine, by the evident powerlessness of the post-1945 institutions of international order in the face of these actions, by the worldwide migration crisis, and by the climate catastrophe. We wanted to find a format that would reflect this sense of gravity in requiring of our speakers cold-eyed analysis, polemical clarity, a willingness to take positions, and that would elevate the skills that we feel are demanded of all of us in this moment, primarily eloquent public speaking and accessibility. No pressure to our speakers. For all these reasons, it is fabulous to see so many people here today at the Kogut. This debate will be the first of 2 this academic year. The second, on a different theme, will take place on March the 6th. Further details will be announced in due course. Today's event addresses the following proposition. We are living through an unprecedented historical moment. The world order established and enforced by the victors in World War II has come to an end. A new world order is yet to be consolidated. This proposition is not a motion. We are not expecting our guests to speak for and against it. What we are hoping for instead is a comradely exchange, the stakes of which might turn on, for example, different interpretations of the word history, different disciplinary approaches to a term such as world order, different conceptualizations of the present historical moment, perhaps different inflections of the word unprecedented. For example, the proposition of unprecedentedness does not necessarily imply a catastrophist analysis, but perhaps also a sense of opportunity. And one of the senses of history that we want to hold on to in our proposition is that of a principle of analysis. To quote Frederick Jameson in 1981, "History is what hurts. It is what refuses desire and sets inexorable limits to individual as well as collective praxis, which its ruses turn into grisly and ironic reversals of their overt intention." End of quote. Are the challenges of the present moment, then, best conceptualized as an end or as a violent resurgence of historical forces after a long period in which we had been acting as if history was over? It's a question perhaps that will be addressed implicitly, if not directly, in what our speakers will say to us today. Let me introduce them both now. Samuel Moyn is the Kent Professor of Law and History at Yale University. His most recent book is Liberalism Against Itself, Cold War Intellectuals and the Making of Our Times, from Yale University Press in 2023. It was based on the Carlyle Lectures in the History of Political Thought that he gave at Oxford in 2022. And it is primarily this book of Professor Moyn's, with its attempt to reimagine a liberalism for our time closer to pre-Cold War traditions, premised on the realization, quote, the realization of universal freedom and equality, unquote, that led us to want to invite him here today. His many other books include The Last Utopia, Human Rights in History, published by Harvard in 2012, Christian Human Rights, published by UPenn in 2015, Not Enough, Human Rights in an Unequal World, published by Harvard in 2019, and Humane, How the United States Abandoned Peace and Reinvented War, by Farrar, Straus and Giroux in 2021. He has written for The Atlantic, The Boston Review, The Chronicle of Higher Education, The Guardian, The London Review of Books, and many other organs, and he is a non-resident fellow of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Mark Blyth is the William R. Rhodes Class of 1957 Professor of International Economics and the Director of the Rhodes Center for International Economics and Finance at the Watson School of International and Public Affairs here at Brown. He holds a joint appointment in the Department of Political Science. His books include Austerity, The History of a Dangerous Idea, published by Oxford in 2015, Angrynomics, co-authored with Eric Lonergan in 2020 from Columbia University Press, and Inflation, A Guide for Users and Losers, co-authored with Niccolo Fracciaroli and recently published by Norton. I strongly recommend his barnstorming article in The Atlantic this past June, titled "The World Economy is on the Brink of Epochal Change." And there it is. What better example of polemic and position-taking do we have than not just that title, but in fact all of Mark's titles. We would like to thank Amanda Anderson and the Kogut Institute for its continuing support of the Political Concepts Project. Thanks also to Damien Maillet, Associate Director of the Kogut, to Gregory Kimbrell, Rachel Ullman, Ben Safran for all their logistical help. Thanks to you all for joining us also on this sunny but frigid day. Samuel Moyn will speak first, and Mark Blyth second. And we're going to follow a debate format. Each speaker will offer an opening statement for 12 minutes or so. We will then hear from both speakers again, responding in part to claims made and positions taken in those opening statements. And we will conclude with a third round of even shorter statements and responses, maybe even more polemical, and then open up the discussion for a few questions directed to one speaker or the other, or to both. At that point, there will be a short break, lubricated by a reception taking place in the room next door. That'll be for 20 minutes or so, before we will reconvene in this room and for a more open-ended discussion where people, the speakers are not really going to be. We've told them, we've promised them that they're not really going to be necessarily required to answer every question. The idea is that this will be a much more free-flowing, open discussion where everybody in the room is really invited to participate in that. So let's welcome our speakers warmly. Let's look forward to Sam's opening statement, and we look forward to the debate. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for having me. Thanks to Adi and Tim, and of course, Mark. This is a daunting challenge. I was given minimal information, in part because I don't think the format was altogether clear in the organizer's mind in advance, and so we're kind of inventing it together, and I hope it can be as participatory as possible. I did try to dutifully formulate a response to the prompt, and I'll give it, but I'm going to begin by disrespectfully ignoring the title and the first part of it, which has to do with whether our moment is unprecedented, because of course every moment is. Every period and second in history is distinctive and unique in some way, although mostly trivial ways. And I assume what should matter is how we effectively historicize the present. And Mark, I know, and I too, are going to engage mainly with the core of the proposition about the order allegedly established after and as a result of World War II, and whether that order is on the brink of change. And to summarize my answer, I'm going to say not really. And that's not because I think the order from 1945 is set to remain in place. Rather, it's because I think it's already changed multiple times. Indeed, so many that we should regard our time as one in a series, indeed one with opportunities and not just risks. To see why that answer might have some bite, I think we do have to discard some myths, and some are of very recent vintage. Take the phrase, the rules-based international order, which was essentially invented or at least propagated after November 2016, when Donald Trump was elected the first time. And that idea that there was a stable system of rules that was somehow unceremoniously cast aside, whether in Trump's first term or second term or by autocrats around the world, Vladimir Putin and so on, as far as I can see, is false. The idea is a lovely one if it had been true. The idea is that there had been a default of peace established at the end of World War II, a prohibition of conquest and annexation, and a free trade order of some kind. But I think that's true only to the extent we lazily content ourselves with the view from the North Atlantic, Western Europe, and the United States, where some kind of order of the kind I just enumerated with those three features was broadly institutionalized. How did things look from outside that relatively small zone? Well, it wasn't how 1945 looked from the rest of the world, and these rules and that order that they supposedly comprise don't really describe global history for much of the period since 1945. It's certainly not true to say that in 1945, a post-imperial order specifically was consecrated. That wasn't the intent of most of the victors of World War II, since European powers, most notably Britain and France, fully planned to keep their empires. And the Soviets set out on building one or an even bigger one, depending on how you interpret the history of the Soviet Union, albeit on contiguous local territory. This country, the United States, meanwhile, pioneered a new form of empire. Daniel Immerwahr has called it pointillistic, converting the Philippines, our old holding from the early 20th century, into a client, but retaining other colonial spaces formally, and treating much of the globe as part of a new kind of informal empire, second to none in world history, governed from air and sea and bases securing that order. So what about the UN Charter from the summer of 1945, San Francisco and so forth? Well, that consecrated a great power peace of empires, and there was an exemption because of the quickly established Security Council veto from any rules of war and peace actually applying on a permanent basis to the most powerful countries in the world. And of course, that remains true to this day, as the invasion of Ukraine proves. So lawlessness and violence, and this was largely due to the hijinks of the Western powers, since the Soviets only directly intervened once beyond its local empire in Afghanistan in 1979. That was the rule. And it's not clear why we should be nostalgic for it merely because we don't like the result of an election or two or a Brexit vote or whatever liberals today find so horrifying about their own experience. As we know, the Cold War, which lasted most of the period in between 1945 and our own moment, exacerbated and framed global decolonization. That was hardly orderly. And North Atlantic powers were unconstrained by rules or even prudence during it. Nor were the rules of free trade universalized. not immediately, in part because of Cold War politics, in part because there was a lot of debate about what the predominant form of post-colonial political economy should be. So that takes us roughly to the 1970s and 1990s, which were, I think, big inflection points that have precipitated a big phenomena in our time, notably the so-called populist backlash. But those transformations would not have been imaginable in the 1940s. The changes that happened in the 70s and 90s, respectively, I think fairly clearly originated, at least in many of their impulses, out of the North Atlantic. But they had massive ramifications for global affairs. Now, I'll come back to the details from my point of view later in dialogue with Mark, but I'm assuming he's going to talk about neoliberalism. But just to say, we could treat the 1970s as the period of inception of neoliberalism and the 1990s as the apex of that ideology. Neither the inception nor the apex, which of course required the end of the Cold War, the 1940s left the world with for all those violent decades, was foreordained or even predictable. Now, in staking out as my main position that the world can't be on the brink of a change of a mythical order because it was mythical, I don't mean to suggest, not for a second, that our sense of how much is at stake today is wrong. History is supposed to provide perspective, but the point can't be to allay our anxieties, anxiety that may be totally legitimate. But then look outside the North Atlantic again. And if you do that in our time, at least in some respects, it seems to be like a moment of immense promise. Not for hundreds of years, maybe a half millennium, have Christian or white powers lacked a fundamental say, the fundamental say, over our common global future. So if you refuse the default view with which we're brought up in this country, and I believe others across the North Atlantic, that a credible future for us all has to be ones that we, coming out of institutions like this, choose. It's a liberatory moment, not necessarily a devastating or paralyzing one. Decolonization, violent as it was, wasn't ever completed because the world has remained hierarchical, and that's changing. And that could be for the better, not for the worse, especially if you believe in the equality of all human beings. So what I really think is at stake right now in the grand scheme of things, and this is where I'll end as a provocation, is where precisely our imperial decline, mainly in this country, but more broadly across the North Atlantic, will lead. We've had for most of modern times a unipolar ascendancy. The Cold War, in that regard, much of the period since 1945, was a kind of a bipolar interregnum. The main story is that the 1940s put down some upstarts, German and Japanese. The price was launching the Soviets into power, but Americans at that moment succeeded the Brits, who'd been the great liberal power of the 19th century and early 20th, and this country succeeded it. And what's happening now, most fatefully, I think clearly, is that America's unipolar ascendancy from the 1990s is appearing to end. So in this sense, I think, in this limited sense only, it's true to say that one legacy of the 1940s is being threatened, call it American empire. But I think we should greet rather than rue this inevitable development. Now, I say inevitable because there was nowhere for this country to go but down. It enjoyed the biggest and I think greatest empire, certainly in its spatial expanse that any has ever enjoyed, very much including Rome's empire. And we all know what happened to Rome. Now, that took centuries. The same could be true in our case. It's just we're recognizing that it's underway more and more. It wasn't that the humbling of Rome was without horrors and terrors, but if there's no way to avoid decline, we should lessen those horrors and terrors and angle to coax a brighter future for humanity out of the end of what was established in the 1940s, and a renaissance, even if you think that dark ages are upon us.
My name is Samuel Moyn. That man is an imposter. Okay. It always works. Okay. I don't really disagree with any of that, so that's a bit of a problem. But I'm going to shift the focus. I'm going to shift the focus up to the global north, not because that's where the rules are, but because that's where the money is. I'm a money guy, so I'm just going to follow the money. So I'm going to tell you a story about following the money. Why do you accept the money that's in your pocket? Anyone can issue money. Airlines issue money. They're called air miles. They're bullshit. You would never send your friend air miles unless you didn't like your friend. But this gets serious when you get to international trade, because if you want to buy nice French wine, you're probably going to pay them not in gold, because it's really awkward to do that, but in some kind of currency. And there's a chance that 6 months from now, that currency will be worth less. It might be even worth more. So you're going to have something to kind of anchor that. And that's basically the first time that we tried to organize money. And we called it the gold standard. And basically what it did was to provide stability and backing so that people would have the confidence to trade with each other and not think they're just going to get a bag of air miles at the end of it, right? And why do I mention this? Well, because I want to focus on the word unprecedented. Now, what's happening now is far from unprecedented. We've done it 3 times before. And I want to walk you through the 3 times that we've done this. And in a sense, that's an attempt to naturalize it. We've been there before. It's just a different version of the same song to a certain extent. But then to suggest why this time, and this is where it connects with what Sam is saying, it is a little bit different. And it does go in the same direction that Sam is suggesting. So let's go back to the gold standard. So basically, what was this? It was a bunch of countries that were very open to flows. This is the period of Ellis Island, as well as the flows of capital. This is when basically empires were being forged, when colonialism was all of the run of the mill for these countries, and basically had intense, as we call it in economics, factor mobility. Now, that was all fine, except that if you run this, if you think about this as a way of doing things, a business model, if you want, better still, let's think about it in terms of an analogy. Imagine that capitalist economies are computers. That is to say that they all have hardware. And the hardware are labor markets, capital markets. Most of them have central banks, this sort of stuff, right? And you can vary the configuration if you want, right? Sweden's a bit different from Germany, whatever, right? So that's fine. And then in any given period, you have a set of ideas, the operating system, that basically says how this stuff should work together, how it fits together, et cetera, right? So with that analogy, let's think about the gold standard as a kind of economic computer that processes basically jobs, income, wealth, et cetera, across the world. Well, it worked quite well, particularly for the people who were running the system and had lots of gold, right? That was going fine. But it did have a bug in the software. And the bug in the software went like this. If you're running a gold standard, would you rather be importing or exporting? So if you're importing, you're giving someone your gold. And if you're exporting, you're actually earning someone's gold. So everybody would like to be an exporter rather than an importer. Now, if you do that, that means you're sucking in demand from everywhere else. You're trying to find markets at everyone's expense. It becomes a beggar thy neighbor policy. Now, once the whole world does this, what happens is the overall price level begins to deflate. It creates a deflationary bias in the system. And that means people are making less profit, so what do? If prices are falling, they then cut wages, and things start to, what's the technical term? Suck. So at that point in time, you get things like everything from the Second Internationale to incipient fascism to rural peasant revolts, et cetera, et cetera. And it doesn't end well. So that bug in the software, deflation, crashed the first computer. And we tried to reboot it in the 20s, and it didn't work. And in the 30s, it really fell apart quite spectacularly. So by the time we get to the 1940s, after World War II, a bunch of people sat in a ski resort not that far from here and said, let's not do that again. How could we do something different? And he thought, right, well, what was the problem we're trying to solve? Well, last time the problem was, I guess, deflation, but more seriously, it became a problem of unemployment, because you had mass unemployment, and that's what fascism fed off of, and that's what communism fed off of. So we need to commit ourselves to this policy of full employment. So how would we all get there with our various hardwares, and how would we think about the software to run this? Well, how about we, for example, stop finance doing whatever they want? We have capital controls. How about we really restrict domestic finance and how it can invest things? How about we empower trade unions? How about we have kind of smaller, relatively closed economies where everyone makes a car and occasionally we swap it, but by and large we consume our own ones? So think you go to France in the 60s, everyone's got a Citroën, right? Go to Italy, it's Fiat, etc., etc. So you create a lot of these economies. Oh, works for a while. Le Trente Glorieux, my favorite one, the Italians call it Il Boom. Right, this is the 30 glorious years. And it's great. I mean, like, in France, you have a trebling of national income. Like, that's unprecedented. But there's a bug in the software. You see, if you run a full employment economy behind capital controls for long enough, then ultimately you're not able to augment productivity at the rate at which wages are going to grow, particularly if you have trade unions. So essentially, you end up creating the conditions for a big inflationary crisis, which is what you had in the 1970s. And that was the bug in the software, and that system crashed. Now, how do you solve it? Well, there was no Bretton Woods meeting, but basically a bunch of people who'd been sitting around from the 60s going, it's all going to end in tears in Chicago and other places, told you it was all going to end in tears, so now we're going to change it. So what was the problem they were trying to solve? Well, partly it was inflation, but partly it was the restoration of profit. Because what had happened in that prior regime, the reason it was Les Comptes Glorieux, was because the wage share of national income went to an all-time high and the profit share went down. Now, we like to talk about capitalist democracy or liberal democracy, but remember which one's the noun and which one's the modifier. You can't have capitalism without profits, and if you're going to run a system like that, you can bet that capitalists are going to try and restore it. So they did, and whether you call it neoliberalism or not, essentially there was a reconfiguration of the hardware. You opened everything up, so you got rid of the power of labor, and you made your central banks independent, and you made monetary stability rather than full employment a target. And then you ran that model, and when you did, guess what happened? Profits went up, wages went down, etc. And you also integrate large parts of the economy, global economies, in a way you hadn't done before. For example, 500 million Chinese workers being added to the global labor supply. That'll shift things up a bit. Now, there was a bug in the software. The bug in the software is, of course, if you're going to crash wages, how do you keep demand and consumption up? And the answer is you basically deregulate your banking sector and give everyone a credit card. And you do that, and it's great, and it works wonders because you're coming from a period of super high interest rates, and you run the spread between that and basically safe asset rate all the way down. And as you do that to make money on a declining spread, financial institutions have this wonderful trick called leverage. So you basically borrow more and more to make the same amount of money as rates go down over time. That creates enormous financial fragility, and eventually in 2008 that went pop. Now, that didn't end it. You see, the first system, the gold standard, staggered on 20s, 30s, and had an awful time, and nobody wants to go back to that. The Bretton Woods system, 1970s, if you were in 1971 and said to someone, how do you think it's going? That's all right, 1977. They were writing the McCracken report. People in DC were freaking out, thought it was the end times. It stabilized, it found a new equilibrium. What happened this time? Well, we'd made a bit of a mistake. And I hate to sound like Scott Bessent, but we gave the central bankers too much power. Because what happened was they said, no one can fail if they're an asset holder. So we're going to buy everything, and we're going to drop rates, we're going to do quantitative easing. It's a fancy way of saying I guarantee the price of your assets. And we're going to just pump tons of liquidity, and it's going to be great. And it didn't. It didn't restore growth, and it led to enormous asset inequality, and all of that's true. And the result of that was a whole bunch of people who had been deindustrialized, deunionized, saw their wages collapse, not just here, but in France, not just here, but in the north of England, not just here, but in eastern Germany, basically said, fuck this. And they got really, really angry. Hence the book, Angrynomics. You might want to have a look at it. But basically, that's where we got to with the story. Now, we're in this interregnum. We're in this moment that Gramscians love to say, you know, the future isn't born, but we're living in the morbid circumstances. I can never quite get the quote right, but, you know, you get the general feel for it. It's like some kind of birthing problem that's gone horribly wrong, right? So, you know, we're in that Gramscian moment. Well, this is where I'm going to go back to what Sam was saying. Here's what's different. It's called China. China runs a $1 trillion trade surplus with the rest of the world. Right? There's no way to actually think about how big that is. But the material consequence of it is they can literally make everything for everyone. And they're actually doing so. The scale of industrial production is unprecedented. And one of the results of this is that when we decided to do that thing called the Inflation Reduction Act, because we couldn't actually call it the Let's Go Green Act because people would go nuts, right? We tried to get in on the game. Forget it. They've taken all those sectors. It's completely over. And one of the results of this now is that the world's changing in ways that we never anticipated. And I'll give you one story about this. In Pakistan, which is a poor country, which suffers what we, in my trade we call the classic current account constraint problems, which is basically all the stuff it needs to import because it doesn't make a lot of very different stuff, basically has to be paid for in dollars. To earn dollars, you need to basically sell a lot of stuff. You don't sell a lot of stuff, you end up dependent on aid and on debt and so on and so forth, right? And a huge constraint for Pakistan, India, and a whole bunch of other countries is oil. Now, what is it the United States has basically risen to power on from 1945? It's the East Texas fields, right? It's oil. We are the world's largest oil exporter and gas exporter. And when the Ukraine war happened and Europe ran out of gas very quickly, it took them a year to figure out where Qatar was. And that's when gas prices went up and so on and so forth. And the Qataris basically said, well, we were going to give all this gas to Pakistan, because you'll pay more. And they shipped it all to Europe. And Pakistan had a terrible time because of this, and so did a whole bunch of other countries. In response, China said, we can make solar panels at cost. And the Pakistani grid is run by the government, which is rather corrupt, and is terribly inefficient, and is horribly inexpensive, and blacks out sometimes, and people never liked it. But now they can do what they're doing, which is to build distributed solar networks. And this is also what's happening in South India, and this is also what's happening all over Africa. And what you're doing when you do that is 1/3 of Pakistan's electricity now runs off its grid. They've just taken it off. So much so the government's on television doing adverts saying, please use the grid. And everyone's like, why? It sucks, but this is awesome. And it's basically free. And the thing is, once you install a technology like this, to go back to my analogy of hardware and software, this is hardware. Once you've got that hardware, once you've installed the interconnectors, once you've basically upscaled your grid, once you've got a local AI firm to optimize your grade variations, once you've got all that tech sorted out, and you can scale this with Chinese exports, which are so cheap no country's ever going to come close, what you're doing is you're breaking the current account constraint. And every time America says to you, you need to sign a trade deal and you need to buy more of our oil and gas, you go, well, why? I've got all this hardware, and I'm going to keep using it. And the more that hardware spreads, the less likely it is you're going to buy the next tank of gas. Now, this country has doubled down under the current administration on a policy of variously tariffs for reindustrialization, but also a phenomenally strong anti-green turn, the Rhode Island wind farm being one of the examples. But the geopolitics of this are extremely important, because unless they can tie people into these long-term gas contracts, we fail. We fade, because China's already changed the game. That's what's different this time. So we've done this 3 times before. It's not unprecedented. What's unprecedented is that China's in the mix, and it's changing the game for everyone. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to invite both speakers to come up and, in fact, ask them to respond. I mean, what I really appreciate in both of these analyses is the utter lack of sentimentality in these positions. I mean, Sam, you are insisting that we get out of our Western liberal box, essentially, and try and if we think outside the Western perspective, there is nothing to rue. In fact, we could almost get our heads around greeting what is happening as historically inevitable. Mark, you're using this extraordinary metaphor of the hardware software, and I'd just like maybe to ask you each to sort of comment on each other's perspectives here. Are you really, I mean, the lack of sentimentality is important, but you're also using different terms. Mark, you're insisting on beginning from where we are, which is to say, where the money is. Mm-hmm. So maybe I could ask you each to respond to each other's perspectives for a few minutes.
Well, this is where the rumors of an impending debate have proved, false. I mean, actually, Mark and I probably agree more with one another than either of us does with the organizers. And here's the central reason why. I think both of us are claiming that, notwithstanding some very important legacies from the 1940s, that what we're living through at present is the challenge to or collapse of the rise of neoliberalism in the 1970s. And I would venture to say that's true in these North Atlantic countries as it is globally. But if that's so, then we really need to have a broader dialogue with the organizers and audience about what is it, let's say emotionally, about the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Bretton Woods, which entered crisis long ago and was functionally displaced, and the laws of war and the Geneva Convention of 1949, which have attracted, I think, the false belief that they somehow founded our moment. Mm-hmm. I think when we look at each of those documents, the chronology proves wrong, and that means the causation proves wrong, and we have to understand our moment, I think, in a much different way, and Mark and I agree about that. And so if we're wrong, we're going to need pushback not from one another, but from you, unless the organizers want to defend their approach. I do want to say two things in response to what Mark did. One is just to elaborate and ask him for more on his story, and then to talk a bit about the present and what may be happening and coming next. So first, I mean, he, I think, very understandably said that it's still important to have one's gaze fixed on the North Atlantic because that's where the money is, and until recently, at least, the rise of China, that's where power has been exercised from. That said, I mean, you can tell a story that I think tracks yours, that brings in the whole world and brings in particular, the outlook of the post-colonial states as they emerged after 1945. After all, what was Bretton Woods about? Full employment on one level as a kind of reigning ideal, a wage bargain supervised by the state in between capital and labor. But this ideal was globalized, and the details mattered so much locally that the system globally was about granting a considerable amount of policy autonomy to national elites. And that was true in the post-colonial states for several decades. And that is what began to change in the 1970s for the whole world with the rise of central banks and also with the debt crisis and the imposition of neoliberal discipline by the International Monetary Fund and World Bank. And as a result of that fact, it's not just Margaret Thatcher's Britain and our country, thanks to Ronald Reagan, that were inducted into neoliberalism. The whole world was. And Mark's book, Austerity, is essential for that reason, that it's really a kind of story of a global switchover. Now, I totally agree with your account of the consequences of that for the well-off tradespeople and union members of the global North. The bill coming due as they respond with rage to their stagnation and really the foreclosure of something that they expected, which is that every generation of their children would be foreseeably better off than them. Not true now. And so the backlash is enormous. What would be interesting is to consider, well, what have been the costs elsewhere? Mm-hmm. The Chinese story can be seen as part of this picture. How did China become rich? How did it industrialize? Well, partly due to a bet on the part of liberal governments that with capitalism would come liberalism. False, but also out of a deterritorialized elite that saw a path to growth through the policy change, and that very much includes Chinese elites. And yet, it does seem that there's some global justice in these events, as I tried to emphasize. And there's no reason why we should think that the rise of China is horrifying. Hierarchy is horrifying, and it's being remediated in and through our time. The question is, is the backlash to neoliberalism in our territories going to lead to ruin, and what are the alternatives coming out? So I'll just close with a question for you about whether we actually have left neoliberalism behind, because you look at the second Trump administration and you see things like tariffs, which are grotesque for the free trade establishment. We could get into debates about whether that's legitimate or not, but it would seem that his main goals otherwise are neoliberal. And that was true the first time around. So this administration, its signature bill, the one big beautiful one, has involved basically a renewal of the tax cuts from the first presidency, and a punitive attitude towards the poor and the suffering and the weak. And that's just straight out of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. And so it seems as if neoliberalism is sustainable in some of these very countries that founded and launched it. And that's not to say it's forever, but it's not obvious that the left has a program that is plausible to replace neoliberalism yet. And so we can talk a lot about, the stresses that it's causing, and there's no doubt that, there's a real story about political backlash, but we don't know if there's a sequel to neoliberalism until someone comes up with one that's better or worse.
So let's start exactly there. I would go back and I'd reframe it this way. We've never not been liberals. That capitalism and liberalism really are not just twins, they are the same being. And you can't have one without the other. And if to go back to my analogy of hardware and software, what was the software of the 19th century? It was classical liberalism. It was essentially a governing ideology of laissez-faire. It was basically hands off the economy. Sound money and accounting principles run the economy like a corner shop. Governments can't get into debt, so on and so forth. And that was sort of the economic side, basically, of the sort of the liberalism of the period in different ways, whether that comes from Gladstone or whether that comes from, let's say, Ricardo earlier on. That's basically that model. And that was heavily discredited. And it's not as if we then discarded liberalism. We didn't. We invented social democracy. Social democracy is just a variant of liberalism. It's not really something that comes from a different path. To me, the best version of it, Eric Helliner's term, John Ruggie's term, embedded liberalism. You took a liberalism that was disembodied, deracinated, globalized, and then brought it back to the nation state. If you think of the writings of Marshall, for example, on citizenship at the end of the war, think of Beveridge and the notion of the welfare state. There's a very clear idea as to who was to benefit from this, and it was a notion of a citizenry which broke in away with liberalism because it accepted the reality of class, but it was based upon a reformation of liberal principles, liberal doctrines, and liberal institutions. There was no escape from liberalism. So neoliberalism was, in a sense, as profit restoration, was hyper-intensification. And with the hyper-intensification came globalization, fragmentation, et cetera, and a fragilism that basically imploded on itself eventually. So that we can't escape from liberalism at this juncture, I think, is really not a surprise, because it is the underlying source code for all the different attempts that we have to write this software. There have been others. Maoism was an attempt to do this. Nehruism, before that collapse, was an attempt to do this. There have been prior ones in previous epochs, empires based upon slavery, however one wants to cut it up. There's been other ways to do this, but for what we'd call the period of modernity to high modernity to post-modernity, there's been a consistent liberalism all the way through it. So that bit doesn't really surprise me. And then it becomes a hybrid. None of them are pure types. They're all hybrids. So when neoliberalism comes to Romania, they don't just take the playbook from the Chicago school. It's adapted to local conditions. And Trump, as an entrepreneurial person, basically is doing exactly the same thing. He will take the bit of sort of, if you will, Herrenvolk welfareism, which he could stomach with his coalition, that white people who work hard, who are deserving, deserve sort of some kind of social benefits. But alongside of this, and I think this is totally incompatible with liberalism, is a regressive reverse modernization. One whereby the future is to be the 1950s and 1960s for white men in manufacturing, and the future for immigrants is the 1940s, and the future for women is some variants of the 1940s to the 1890s. And nobody actually really wants this. It's a bit like the sort of the fantasy of reindustrialization. If you survey Americans about reindustrialization, they go, "That's a really good idea." And you say, "Would you work in a factory?" They're like, "No chance." So it's not quite clear how we're going to put all this together. So the fact that it's liberal and anti-liberal, riven with contradictions, and at the same time instrumental to a class, that's exactly what I would expect it to be, because in a sense, that is liberalism's secret. That's its success. It is a chameleon, it's a chimera. It's something where you look into it and see the bits that you want. And the real genius of the neoliberal period, to go back to human rights, the subject you've written a great deal about. I'll give you a story. I was invited to give, when populism, et cetera, was kicking off, when I wrote the austerity book, basically implicit in this was that there's going to be a reaction thesis to this. And I was invited to the OSF in New York. And there used to people coming in and giving talks about human rights. And I basically came in and gave a political economy talk that said, nobody's going to give a shit about your human rights. This is all going to get really ugly really quick. And you really didn't want to hear that. And I was just puzzled as to why, because you want your projects to survive. You want your institution to do well. And then I had this moment of clarity about rights under neoliberalism. The types of rights you get under neoliberalism are costless. Right? They're not funded by taxes. They're not about redistribution. You don't take from one group to give to another to improve their law. You simply give rights, whether those are the rights to gay marriage, whether those are the rights to sexual and gender equality. They're not to cost anyone anything. They're what everyone in Whole Foods can agree is a good right, because none of them have to pay any taxes to provide them. And those rights are fragile precisely because of that. Because at the end of the day, when it comes to, are you really willing to pay a cost for these rights? The answer is no, and that's what we're seeing now, is the fragility of those neoliberal rights.
Can I ask you, Sam, what you think of Mark's hardware-software metaphor? Because, I mean, and I have a version of this question for you as well, Mark. Like, is liberalism part of the software? And if so, I mean, how do we interfere with the software? How do we, in fact, wreck the software? I mean, can we spam the software? Where is there anything else?
Hack is the word you're looking for.
Okay, hack. Is there anything outside the metaphor? I mean, where is human rights? Is that part of the software? I mean, how does that feed into the model? So, I mean, first of all, I mean, do you, Sam, do you sort of like want to accede to this hardware-software metaphor that Mark is interested in?
Well, I'm happy to. I'll say a little bit about that, and if I might, I could say a little bit about liberalism. I mean, because you told me I hadn't known before that I was invited to speak about liberalism, and now Mark has triggered me slightly by, expounding his own views about that. So I think it's a useful analogy to think about software and hardware at a kind of, at a global scale. I'm not sure in the end it fits with the kind of social theory I would back, because it just seems like it could be a kind of something parallel to a material ideal distinction. It could be a parallel to something like an institutionalized structure and everything else distinction. I think most of those distinctions are, can be clarifying and help us start conversations, but in the end, I just think as a matter of social theory, we should think of everything as deeply embedded in everything else. And it's not like we can usefully understand history by saying there's one group of people that's building the computers and another group of people that's writing the programs. So I wouldn't want to end up as useful as the analogy is for just writing an article in the Atlantic. come down, if I were writing a book, and say, well, capitalism is the hardware and liberalism is the software, which seems far too simple. Now, on liberalism, I mean, I like your story, and there's no doubt that liberalism and capitalism we have to figure out their relations to one another, and generally, I think you got them right. But I would just introduce some anomalies in your history of liberalism, which are absolutely central to my own way of thinking about the concept, and I say this with some trepidation because the greatest scholar in my view of liberalism is right here, Professor Anderson. Maybe she'll intervene later. In the 19th century, who is the most influential liberal? Again, if we're thinking globally, which we must, and the answer is very straightforward. It's Giuseppe Mazzini, the Italian. And that tells us that liberals invented nationalism and bequeathed it to the world in the 19th century, along with some other nationalists in Eastern Europe who wanted to overthrow their empires and were inspired by liberal principles to do so. They weren't at least consciously, out to, update their political economies in a capitalist direction. We can totally debate the way in which nationalism ideologically serves capitalist transformation, but it seems like if we're interested in something even today, like the tangle of the Israeli and Palestinian peoples, both activated by nationalist sentiment, we can't tell us a story about liberalism having been individualistic and cosmopolitan from the start and in the 19th century. On the contrary, it also birthed this incredibly forceful thing ideologically and practically of nationalism. But much more important, when I look back at the liberal authors I teach and care about, none is primarily interested in markets as the way of institutionalizing human freedom. John Stuart Mill had a little bit more sympathy for them in his earlier thought, but dies a Bernie bro, and rightly so. Alexis de Tocqueville. I mean, it's not, what does liberalism mean to this kind of figure? It seems as if we sacrifice a lot, just sticking with the 19th century, when we think of liberalism as something that's primarily about the advancement of market values, because actually it bequeaths to the world this completely different aspiration, which is the aspiration to engage in self-making, including through economic means and economic invention, but not exclusively. And so that's essential to me, because I would want to save both of those elements of liberalism that, let's say, you omit in your story about classical liberalism. Not that, that wasn't prevalent practically in the 19th century and the free trade ideologies of that period, especially English, but that there's something to rescue even from that period in the history of liberalism. And I think it's important to rescue for our own time, because our neoliberal period has involved a kind of return, not a facsimile of classical liberalism, but it rhymes. And the question is, on what basis do we contest that? What should we hope for on the ruins of neoliberalism, if that's what we're indeed living through, or on the ruins of American decline, if that's what we're living through? Well, we have to have orientation, and I would hope that there are things in liberalism that can orient us that we need to rescue, but only if we don't tell a story in which liberalism is just a kind of smokescreen for capitalism.
So back to the smokescreen. I, of course, agree with that, but I'm going to disagree for the following reason. I have a very different 19th century in mind. So you began with a critique of the rules-based system as basically being something that was made up by people who were scared of an American future in the early 21st century, which I think is a very nice way of putting it, because it is basically just made up. But the order underneath that, whether we refer to the dollar or the pound before it, right, the hierarchies that go with it, the sort of the empires that go with it, are Anglo-American. And, it's great that, Italians got their inspiration from this, but really, I mean, it was a footnote in that period. And that's not to say the lessons can't be drawn from that. But essentially, the way I would tell the 19th century is a struggle between two strands of sort of a British liberalism. One is a Ricardian version, which has absolutely no social context, where labour is just a factor input, whereby there's a common rate of profits to which everything gravitates towards. And the original reason we have free trade, most people, of course, never know this, is because your own markets are just going to get exhausted, so you have to go steal someone else's. I mean, it's basically a justification for colonialism. That's where this starts. And then there's a sort of version of that that sort of like, you know, plod us through. Miller's a very interesting one, exactly as you say, and he dies at Bernabro, you're quite correct. But there's in between that, there's people like Marshall, right? There's people that basically become, you know, are the critique of imperialism from Hobson, who are part of this tradition. And sort of the entire sort of like British intellectual apparatus is raised in a set of ideas that Keynes called the unquestionable. And the unquestionable was liberalism. It was deep, and it was their version. But in a sense, they were ruling the world. So by the time you get to sort of the accident of 1945, by which I mean America wakes up one day with 60% of global capital and 50% of global trade and goes, oh shit, what are we going to do with this? It's a very different liberalism, but it's a liberalism that's educated in Oxford as much as it's educated in Yale. And the two of them read the same stuff and think the same stuff, and no one's thinking about what third world intellectuals are thinking about at that point. And we are living on the fumes of that. We're living on the fumes of those institutional traces. And that's the way that I see liberalism persisting, and why I see a continuity where you see a difference. And I think both of them are apparent.
You both tell these really compelling historical stories, but those historical stories have something in common to me, which I think we might just talk about before we open things up. And that is that there's no... I don't hear in either of your accounts a story of how the political story is going to change right now. I mean, are we condemned to essentially this, you know, authoritarian moment? I mean, it sounds to me that you both see that as pretty inevitable, as essentially consequent upon the shifting of influence and power from the United States, from the West in general. But how are we in our current moment supposed to? How do you imagine us envisaging the progress of social democracy in our moment politically? I mean, do you have a sense of that? I mean, political parties, in particular in the United States, let's say, to get things fairly local.
Sure. So again, I think we should take a reality check just so we have a sense of the baseline. Remember that, you know, the United Kingdom becomes a social democracy when it's still an empire, and it had a you know, blatantly hierarchical sense of who would get the entitlements of social democracy, and that was true for the other states that we could name. I think at the height of embedded liberalism, this country was backing a lot of global authoritarians. Mm-hmm. So it's not as if there was a moment of freedom that was somehow pure at any point. And I strongly believe that a lot of the mistakes of liberals in our lifetimes, when there was a chance to avoid the Trump era, helped instead pave the way for it. And that's not just their choices in political economy, but also their choices in war and peace. But I'm not at all a pessimist. Mm-hmm. You know, I think that the Gramsci reference is apt, mm-hmm. that there are a lot of monsters being birthed in the interregnum period, but it's not in the least a hopeless situation. And that's why I try to lead with the sense that there's a kind of rectification of some of the hierarchies we've had globally. Mm-hmm. Admittedly, China is still a despotic state, that were never even imaginable at the height of embedded liberalism. And so I think we should, avoid any nostalgia for any prior period. And if there are things to be nostalgic about in liberalism, it's certainly not the acts of the liberals in history. It's only some of their ideas. which of course we have to save from the liberals themselves, including recently. But I think it's very imaginable that the Democratic Party could win elections in this country. The question is, how can they put together an adequate coalition? How can they reverse their disastrous mistake of the neoliberal period, really to create a constituency that unites the, let's call it the urban rich and poor in the same party, and abandon the rest of the country, including a lot of people in the working class across racial lines. But these are all reversible choices. It just requires enough losses. And to me, the staggering thing is that for all the talk under Trump 1.0 of the need to learn lessons and the need to reorient liberalism and blah, 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 it didn't happen, at least to any adequate extent, because we know that Trump became more popular as a result of whatever the recent period has involved. And so what I'm hoping for is that some of these left parties across the Atlantic, across the world, having fallen on such hard times through their own mistakes, can, enjoy a generational succession. And that doesn't mean it's going to be easy or even likely to put together progressive alternatives. But if it weren't possible, what would be the point of any of these discussions?
Thanks.
So it's not that I want to talk Sam's new book, but when it's got good ideas in it, you might as well make them your own. The older you are, the richer you are, particularly if you live in rich countries. You just basically have to survive long enough and you have assets, and the assets accumulate value over time. And now we have a gerontocracy. And the gerontocracy is in Congress, and young people are completely disengaged from politics because you can't even get a goddamn house and a decent place to live, et cetera, et cetera. We know all this. So to me, the problem with the Democrats and also Labour in the United Kingdom and also the rump of what became the French Socialists and definitely the SPD in Germany is they've become either pensioners' parties, like that's all they give a crap about is basically maintaining pensions, because pensioners in some countries vote 3 times as much as young people, right? Or alternatively, they are, as I like to call them here, the party that shops at Whole Foods. Because if you can afford to shop at Whole Foods, you don't really have any problems. And far from being the radicals that gave us the New Deal that built national economic institutions for the first time, that based it upon racial exclusion, but eventually desegregated the military, eventually did civil rights, eventually did a lot of really important stuff, we've now become the party of the status quo. We don't really want anything to change. If you're shopping at Whole Foods, everything's great, right? So what exactly are the policies for change that the Democrats are thinking about? Abundance? I mean, really? That's it, right? So, when some of the left, I mean, first of all, think about what happened to Bernie, right? I mean, they tried to murder him in the bath on 3 occasions, right? The Clinton campaign took him out in 2016, right? He was shoved to the side again in 2020. They're absolutely terrified. I mean, we've got somebody in New York who's winning, right? The donor class of the Democrats think this guy is Stalin. His concrete policy proposal is, can we please have 4 grocery stores that aren't fucking Whole Foods? That's Stalinism in these people's minds, right? So when that's what you're working with, I just don't see it going anywhere. And I think that's really where the Democratic left is stuck almost everywhere. They've become the party of absolutely defending the status quo whilst giving everyone else neoliberal rights that don't cost them anything. And, and that's a disastrous equilibrium. So does that mean you end up, stuck with rightist populism? Unfortunately, I think it is, because the other thing that we really screwed up was immigration. And it turns out they don't live in our neighborhoods. They don't come and live on the east side of Providence. They don't. They live somewhere else. And when they come in as refugees, they take up a lot of space, like hotels and other things, that people in those communities go, it'd be nice if I could spend a weekend in the hotel, but I can't afford it. But they've got 300 people who are foreigners living in it. This is bait. This is dynamite for populists. We mismessaged it, we mishandled it, we just done it wrong, and we denied it over and over again that there was any deleterious effects to this whatsoever. There's a couple of stats for you. Between 1997 and today, more people immigrated to the United States, to the United Kingdom, from outside the United Kingdom, than between 500 AD and 1945. Now you say, come on, Mark, that's a statistical trick. The economy is much smaller, there are less people, you have to look at proportions. All right. Between 2011 and 2025, more people moved in than that period. This is unprecedented. Now, if you're a cosmopolitan liberal like me, this is freaking awesome. It's great. I speak 3 languages. I'm an Ivy League professor. I travel all around. I have zero problem with this. I don't live in the communities that see this as a downside. And the Democrats have absolutely no ability to talk to those people whatsoever. And you cannot win an election with the people who vote and shop in Whole Foods. It's just not enough. So I think that that's the road that we're going to go. Now, luckily, I'm a global macro person. I tend to think that what happens locally is less important than what happens globally on many occasions. So I'll give you the better story. The better story is the world's going to develop into 2 sets of states, petrostates and carbon states. And that basically the United States is trying to lock in its carbon advantage with itself and its allies and the people it can browbeat with trade agreements. And we're going to just milk that Ford F-150 economy for as long as possible. And the thing about decarbonization in rich Western societies is it involves costs. If you want people to install heat pumps, you have to give them a huge subsidy. If you want to do that, you have to make sure there's enough plumbers, but there aren't because you didn't send them to trade school because everybody went to university, so it costs a fortune, right? So there's all these problems that we have in putting forward decarbonization. If you're in Pakistan, you're getting free solar panels and your grid doesn't work. Take it. Just change it. It's so much easier. They don't have a gerontocracy that's obsessed with maintaining the value of their state pensions. Change it. Make it happen. They don't have veto points all through our polity like we do because of the billionaire class. Change it. Make it happen. They have their own billionaires, but one of the interesting ones is India, which is run basically by 4 billionaire families, each of one who owns giant industrial conglomerates. Guess what? They own all the carbon assets and all the green assets. So I will absolutely use this one, and when it's my call, I will move into this one when it's profitable. And that's what we're beginning to increasingly see. So I think that what happens is that we have, in a sense, exhausted the terrain of, if you want, I've never liked the word neoliberalism, but I'll use it as shorthand. We've completely exhausted this terrain. We've exhausted its electoral possibilities. It is literally a dead end. And the reaction to this will be a Herrenvolk welfare white populism. And that's what you're seeing pretty much everywhere across the countries that I know anything about in the global north. Is this the end times? No. Because what's happening is that 4/5 of humanity do not live in these places. And they've got an entirely different script to write, and it's one that we can't even imagine.
Okay, excellent. I think you disagree, finally, in major ways. Okay, I think it's time we should open things up a little bit. So please, there is a roving mic. Rachel is brandishing it. So please ask any questions or make any comments that you would like to. Amanda, here, please. Yeah.
Thank you both. This has really been wonderful. I really have appreciated all of your contributions. I completely agree with what Sam said about aspirational liberalism and not reducing it to some sort of, driver of all that is bad in the world. I guess one question that I'm sort of struggling with listening to, especially to you, Mark, but I would love to hear what both of you have to say about it, is what your conception of, or if you have a conception of political will. Another question one might add to that is, what is your conception of human nature? Because, your descriptions of how things are unfolding, are laced with a kind of cynical self-interest model of why people act, and that's why follow the money is sort of just right. That's the that's the soundbite that kind of drives it all. But what I want to kind of think through, and this also goes to the really interesting question of the hovering question of what do the organizers think? I want to hear about that too. But you talked a little bit at the very end of your last comment about states that are, making other things happen and the conditions are ripe for that. But I'm really, really curious. I don't hear a significant and compelling political psychology, sociology, and theory of human nature. It's all implied in the story that you tell. And I wonder if you could just say more about that.
on the same, or you just go with that?
Why don't you
Yeah, all right,
answer, and then
all right,
we'll
fine.
hear from...
Wow, what a question. I try never to think about human nature. Because, you know, as they say in Catholicism, it's ineffable. So what we do is we do something very crude. We think about self-interested versus altruism, and of course we are all these things at once, and many more contradictions beside on a micro level. So how should we think about it driving us? This is probably why I spent a large chunk of my career studying ideas, particularly economic ideas, which is because of the following. I understand the current moment in the UK is the function in large part of what happens when you basically take an entire ruling elite, put them through PPE at Oxford, and then give them a job. Because they literally can't think out of that box, right? And then when you tell people that sort of like, well, the most important stuff you should learn is economics, you go off and you learn lots of economics, and it tells you that people behave in a certain way. But more importantly, they tell you need guardrails. You need guardrails against democracy, because if you don't, politicians will spend this into impecunious. And you can't give them any serious policy tools, because if you do, they'll just screw up. Look what happened in the 70s. And you end up with a ruling class that basically gives out to central banks monetary policy, freezes fiscal policy, has zero ambition to do anything, and sits around and tweets about things. And it's all fine so long as everything's going well, as it was in that kind of, like, let's say, 1993 to possibly 2004 period, and the sort of, you know, the neoliberal golden age. But the minute the rubber hits the road, these people are useless. And they just tell, I mean, my sympathy for the central banks is the following. They may have screwed it up, but they've only got two tools: buy and sell assets, raise and lower the price of money. And we said to them, you run everything, okay? And they went, we've got this, because there's nothing to do, because it's all going fine. And then when it all went to shit, they went, we've only got two tools. Ah, shit. And they did what they did, right? But then there was no learning from this. There was no attempt to recover the power of the state. There was no ambition after this. I mean, it was quite obvious what had happened. Banking should have been put in a box, should have been redistributionary taxes, there should be no such things as billionaires. I mean, like, it's bloody obvious if you want to stabilize that system. And there was no attempt to do this. Now, if I want to think about why that happens, if I go to human nature, I don't know what to do with it. But if I think it through a lens of, you basically raise a generation to think within a certain prism, a certain paradigm, if you like that word, and they really can't think out of it, because it is in itself perpetuating elite, right? Spoiler alert, we're part of this, right? And you only marry each other, and you only talk to each other, and you go to the same institutions, and you work in the same firms, and that's where all the money is. Epistemic narrowness is here. Possible outcomes is here. When the outcomes start happening over here, they have no idea what to do. So that's how I would think about this. I don't think that, for me, generatively, human nature is not a good place to start or end. I'd rather think about, why do we think the world is the way it is when we can imagine it in different ways? And why are they so incapable of imagination?
But there are lots of people who imagine it in different ways. And there are that's why I started with political will. But I won't take up more time. But, you know, I mean, talking about the ruling class and where they were educated, that's a sort of a sociological explanation, which is, I think, where you start.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
Sam, why don't you say something, if you would like to, in response, and then Adi will ask the next question.
Sure. Well, I think, you know, the question of political will is a central one. And I think you could, you know, with a squint, emerge from this era with a more uplifting account, you know, just trying to wrest hope from hopelessness. You know, what happens in 2016? Elites after the Brexit vote and in this country after Hillary Clinton's loss, you know, spend years trying to undo what the people have wrought. Now, in this country, the first time, of course, it wasn't even a majority or a plurality. It was the Electoral College, but we know that, you know, the second time, there's a substantial enough political will to challenge, you know, elite mistakes. I think we should save liberalism from the liberals, but they're being punished by the right in our day. And that's a story about political will and the possibility of reclaiming it and holding out against one, you know, like, even though like the campaign against Trump has been waged in the name of #OurDemocracy. And of course, he is a threat to democracy in some sub-definitions. He represents a backlash of these ordinary people against what elites have wrought. And that means that others can harness that power. And so I didn't see much of it in my youth, but in my middle age, it seems like political will is a real factor in what we see. And that means the question is who gets to harness it and to what ends.
Adi.
Thank you both. It was really great. I would like to speak as an organizer, not in the name of the organizers, because this was a committee, we reached a compromise, we reached some kind of text, and maybe each one of us has a different take on it. We didn't, the prompt did not represent what we think. It represents what we ask you to refer to. And it didn't come out of nothing. It came out, for me at least, of collecting. It has become kind of a hobby. Collecting essays, books, and articles by really interesting and really serious people. Some of them you know, some of them maybe you never heard of. Some of them American academics, some of them are from Europe, some of them are from Israel, some of them are from Palestine, from the Arab world, all over the place. And they're all saying something really close to what we put on in the prompt. The world order is coming to an end. And it is coming to an end because we see that we literally see that it's coming to an end because we look at the pictures from Gaza. And because we follow up the war in Ukraine. Gaza featured more than Ukraine for different reasons, maybe obvious. So what do you do with this? It is at least an image of a world order. It's the world order as it exists in the political imaginary, not of a particular class or group, but across the globe, more or less across the globe. You could say, well, it's ideology. It is just a screen, and we have to look through it. But this ideology brought millions of people to the streets during the protests in the case of Gaza. So what do you do with it? How do you explain it? How do you explain the existence of this political imaginary? And if you would agree, and the discrepancy between this political imaginary and what you are describing, the big discrepancy.
Well, okay, so I think it's a really useful challenge. I mean, I think it could be addressed narrowly or less narrowly. On Gaza, I mean, I choose my words carefully, but it seems peculiar to suggest that there was an order dating from the 1940s that is being upended in Gaza now. I mean, I don't think there's like an inevitable teleology from the founding of the State of Israel in the 40s to our time. But that doesn't mean that there haven't been constant episodes of anti-Palestinian violence starting with the founding of the State of Israel and in multiple episodes of mowing the lawn and counter-violence. And so I think a lot would depend on whether, for principled or strategic reasons, we're willing to say that what has happened in the past 2 years is out of the ordinary. What if that is part of the order we've inherited? And it's not clear to me, based on what happened yesterday, that that order, or disorder, I'd prefer to call it, is changing anytime soon. Now, there's a much broader, answer, which would have to take on, well, this myth, as I've called it, and I've attributed the desire to smash it not just to myself but Mark, that the 1940s really were the crucible of the contemporary world. And I would say our presentations are intended to undermine that premise, as widely shared as it is. Now, I agree with you that it would be very interesting to try to understand the emotional or psychological foundations of our attachment to the end of World War II as our founding. I think part of it has to do with the notion that there was a pure cause in World War II, and that there was a settlement that opened an optimistic new era. And I started my comments by saying that depended on who you were. W.E.B. Du Bois shows up at San Francisco and says, you're leaving 750 million people under empire. That's what your new order is? That's the old order. So I just feel that the generation or so of critical history of what actually happened in the 1940s should be defended against the myth. And that means we then would take our bearings more honestly and realistically, from different signposts. But this is not a good answer because I totally take your point that there's a security blanket attachment to the 1940s and a kind of, false idealization of it, which itself is a fact of our times and has to be reckoned with. I will add that the phrase rules-based international order was first used in President Obama's national security vision statement for 2015. So that phrase is no older than 9 years, 10 years old. And it's remarkable that if you study, it's then mobilized in 2016 as what's at stake. But that's the myth, not the reality.
But but can I just ask, just to follow up, Sam, because in your book on liberalism, you do have an idea of pre-Cold War liberalism that involves universal claims to freedom. I mean, universal rights. I forget if rights is part of it, but universal claims to freedom. And you're very clear that you don't want to be nostalgic for that. That your conception of a new liberalism is something original, and yet what does that pre-Cold War value-laden concept of liberalism, how does that fit into your refusal to be nostalgic, or your resistance to nostalgia?
Well, no. So I do think that liberals in various ways do make universalizing claims all the way back, and then we have to debate: was John Locke a liberal, or was Benjamin Constant the first liberal, or whatever? But whomever we choose, they're universalizing claims. I don't think that's the limit of my nostalgia with respect to liberal universalism, just because, in fact, liberal universalism was much more in practice about economics and empire. And then what I try to salvage from before the Cold War is not universalism, but romanticism and progressivism, which I think are more credible, were more credibly embraced, at least for their own zone, the European Euro-Atlantic zone, by liberals in the 19th century. Okay. And that provides a basis for some kind of future liberal or post-liberal.
Great. Okay, thanks so much.
Sure.
There's a couple of questions. There's one from the back there.
Thank you, Kogut Institute, for organizing this, and Professors Blyth and Moyn as well for your insightful commentaries. I guess I'm just trying to put together a lot of what has been said and to think more about specifically those, whether we're thinking about following the money or whether we're thinking about new liberalism, right? New will, self-making, coming out of empire for real this time. How do we think about those poorer countries? And I mean, our imaginary is still quite narrow, it seems. We've thankfully touched on Ukraine and Gaza. We haven't discussed Sudan or Ethiopia or Haiti. What's going on in Argentina, Brazil? What can we say about the unprecedented nature of this moment for those countries? Are they really I think, Samuel, at some point you had said that you're not a pessimist and you see this sort of, there's a moment of maybe opportunity and a lessening of hierarchy with the decline of the American empire. But what does that story look like for those countries moving forward, really? This is a question for you, Mark, as well. You know, I guess the changing out of hardware, changing out of software, you know, putting in solar power grids, and this is all great, but is that really lessening the kind of colonial, imperial like dependency of a lot of these still not completely decolonized states moving forward? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. I think that right at the heart of your question is, can we get to a state where there's no hierarchy? And I don't think we can. Simply because big countries' footprints are bigger. When you chuck a bigger rock in the pond, it displaces more water. And I'll give you an example of this from my neck of the woods, right? So around 1980, the United States realized it was losing its edge in traditional industries, and it went all in on tech and biotech. And when it did that, it wrote a bunch of international trade agreements called the TRIPS and TRIMS and various things. And basically, it lengthened patent protection and said, if you use our stuff, you have to pay license fees. And it basically was a developmental disaster for the global south, right? And everyone wrote lots of articles about why this is a developmental disaster. And then along came China, and China went, I don't care. And I'm going to steal your stuff. I'm going to make it without any copyright. I'm going to counterfeit it. I'm going to make it my own and ship it out at half the price. I'm going to destroy this. And those agreements, basically, apart from rich country to rich country, failed to have any meaning. And that created a huge amount of space. So, for example, South Africa and Brazil, that's when they basically became sort of more prominent. It's when Brazil basically stood up to the US and said, we'll do our own HIV medicines, which then shifted the debate on global pharmaceuticals, which then made India the largest producer of generics, right? So there's loads of things that happen in the space. Now, here's the way that this carves the other side, right? So China now, when you look at what China exports, it exports everything. And there used to be this idea of the flying geese, that basically you'd have one country at the front that was the technological leader, and as it went forward, it went up the product chain, and it did more expensive stuff, right? And that left those spaces for the other geese to come in, and we all moved together. Right? It's very much the East Asian story. China now makes everything. There's almost no space for anyone else. So the same historical event that busted up the American attempt to rewrite the rules in its favor is the one that's now creating such displacement across different export sectors that there's no room for the geese to fly. So my thing is, it's less about sort of the, if you will, the political institutions behind this, if you will, not even the colonial legacies, the sort of like kind of put it, the implicit imperialism of the moment, rather than the fact that when you have these world historical forces just doing what they do, they're such big beasts. They change the game for everyone, and they create a new form of hierarchy. So if you're in Pakistan now, you get yourself off the oil curse because you go all in on solar. Great. You're now dependent on Chinese solar imports and everything that goes with it. You have swapped one dependency for another. It's a question of which one you're more comfortable with.
What was said about why China even got to this place? Like, it wasn't just sort of pure accident, and there was a lot of investment as well from the West, thinking on the sort of political will side that liberalism would emerge in China. And I don't know why that imaginary was possible in one place rather than others, but that might also still be colonial legacy in some ways.
I would agree.
No, I sympathize with the question. I tried to start by saying we need to look beyond the North Atlantic to take the measure of our time, and I just tried to make the point in vague terms that, you know, a multipolar world relative to the unipolar one under British hegemony in the 19th century or ours in the 20th could be better, at least from the perspective of the fair sharing of power. Of course, it could be worse. It really depends how each place plays its cards, and whether the central bankers, who are the real power brokers on a global scale, including many central bankers of color, decide to play their cards, and there's going to be a struggle, and the result could be more hierarchy, not less. I mean, we're living in a time when, you know, the white world is creating a series of gated communities on a national scale in the North Atlantic, Australia, and so forth. So that could be worse. But again, if our concern is gerontocracy, there's really one place where you don't have this graying of populations and the demographic transformations that are unprecedented. I will use that word for once when it comes to gerontocracy, and that's sub-Saharan Africa. And so I think that could be the place where liberalism has its true future, and we just have to hope that's true.
What I'd like to do is just take 3 comments without, in fact, asking you guys to respond to them. After those 3 comments, we're going to break for a reception, which is going to be next door, and we'll kind of use those 3 comments as the sort of like starting off point for our wider conversation when we come back. So maybe, Vazira, you had something you were going to say. No?
It's probably a good moment to ask it following the previous question. I think something I want to restitute to the post-war period is an anti-colonial imagination, if there is an aspirational moment there. And maybe that is the aspiration of building another kind of world which doesn't come to pass, arguably, but if one thinks from Pakistan and Palestine, and especially the examples you were giving of Pakistan, a kind of colonial order is very palpable. So the aspirational moment of the post-war period has given way to a shift from the American to, say, Chinese imperialism. But I'm not sure how to understand. We have an economic understanding from what you're suggesting of the transformation that's happened on the ground. But what are its political implications? I don't quite understand. What is the political imagination that goes with having a China as, do we think of it as a colonial power in the ways we have understood liberalism and European imperialism, forging a kind of political system to which maybe post-war was a moment for at least contesting or reimagining? If in this moment China is the new site of interrogation, how do we think about political ideas in relation to this? And maybe that might be a point of conversation between Sam and Mark.
Excellent. Thanks. Holly.
You realize this is pure hierarchy. You're not taking anyone who's not senior faculty. I'd just like to point this out.
Does anyone not senior faculty want to ask a question? What's your name? Danny. Did you say Danny? Yes. Okay. Holly first and then Danny.
The defense rests its case.
This is a question about states, which I feel have been sort of present but not very here. And I'm thinking about states in terms of when we talk about the tip into populism, is it possible that this is driven by 2 factors? One is that a bunch of people are sort of saying, hey, guess what? Politics is made at the level of states, not at the level at which you're talking. And so, therefore, pulling politics back to the level of the state, and the other dynamic might be with respect to something like China and the United States, that at the level of the populist leadership, that it has been convinced that the next geopolitical race will have to be undertaken by big states, specifically the technological one connected to AI. And so, like the reason why states have to be all-powerful and why the person at the top of the state has to be all-powerful within that state is to break all the rules in order to, achieve total hegemonic domination in the AI field. And so this notion that states are, somehow like on 2 ends of this. And my question is really, okay then, hypothesis discussed, but how does one then think about politics? does one return to the state and say, yeah, we'll take you on this terrain? In which case, which aspects of, let's say, national does one take on, Mazzini style? Or does one say, no, we don't think about states, we don't think like states, we're going to do this at another level, in which case, how?
Great, thank you, Holly. Danny.
Thank you. I have a very junior clarification question, and it's for Mark. You say that neoliberal rights are fragile because they're costless. I'm wondering whether you could elaborate on that, because theoretically and intuitively, I would assume that rights that are costless are easier to gain support and to build correlations around it, instead of rights that are actually costly to implement. So, yeah, thank you.
Okay, wonderful. And then there's one at the back there. Do you want to say your name?
Hi, my name is Jules. I'd like to thank the two of you for this wonderful little debate. I have noticed that there is this sort of single linchpin that much of this discussion revolves around, which is that, okay, neoliberalism is failing, China's here, the United States is going to fall because of that. But I've heard this story before with Japan, with the European Union, heck, a little bit with the Soviet Union too. Each one of these had the hardware that Professor Blyth has mentioned to be able to change the math. Soviet Russia had the hardware. Japan had the hardware. EU a little bit too. Now China. And China has definitely tried to with the Belt and Road Initiative. They stopped that because they ran out of money. And I don't see the countries they've invested in, mostly African, really changing the game all too much right now. Versus, I look at the United States. I hear a lot of stories from progressives about how neoliberalism has failed, yet year after year, the United States still shows up. It still grows. It's still doing better every year. And so when I look and I hear people say we have to change the system, it seems to be doing just good enough to survive. People will speak up or they'll show up, and I'm seeing not enough showing up for this to be a real problem, because each year the United States keeps getting through it. And now look at China. It's going slower. It's stagnating. They've got problems ever since zero COVID. And so I don't see, if I was a betting man, and I was to look at prior times, and I'd say, is the United States going to flounder now, or are they not? I'd bet that they're going to keep going. I don't see neoliberalism flounder against all the societal failures that it does pose with inequality and whatnot. If I'm to bet, it looks like it's going to keep going.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much, everybody.